What's going on at the Heritage Foundation and elsewhere with all this confusion about how to deal with antisemitism and more broadly with what's being called post-liberalism? And also, why is President Trump suing the BBC for bias? Hello, everybody. I'm Graham Walker, coming to you from Independent Institute in Oakland, California, where we will try to provide an independent take on these issues and more. For today's Independent Outlook discussion, I'm joined by my colleagues, Dr. Philip Magnus, who holds our David J. Thoreau Chair in Political Economy, and Dr. Williamson Evers, Director of our Center on Educational Excellence. Welcome, both of you.
Happy to be here.
Thank you.
Before we tackle the prickly subject of the internecine battles on the political right, let's take a moment to check in with you, Phil Magnus, about what's going on in the constantly changing world of President Trump's tariffs. In particular, Phil, is it true that President Trump's administration has finally admitted that tariffs raise prices?
Indeed, it is true, and this is after almost 8 months of denying that basic economic truth. And the reality is that we've started to notice prices creeping up in the retail sector, but especially at the grocery store, including on items that are simply not growable in the United States. Two in particular that have come into the news recently are bananas and coffee, which, with a very limited number of exceptions in places like Hawaii, is just not viable to grow those products on U.S. soil. We don't have the climate for it. We don't have the weather for it. You have to import it from the tropics. And as prices are going up, the Trump administration has started scratching its head and said, wait a minute, this is politically unpopular. People are noticing that their breakfast coffee and their bananas and certain other fruit items are much more expensive now. And they don't seem to be rewarding that all that much at the ballot box, as we saw in the 2025 elections in a couple of states last week. So as a result, the Trump administration has started to walk back specific item tariffs in some of those territories.
But, they haven't really trumpeted it as much as they did before. It seemed like it kind of quietly reduced. Why the quietness? Why not blare it from the rooftops?
Well, because at the same time, they're trying to maintain a face before the Supreme Court in the ongoing case that asserts that tariffs are a good thing, they're desirable, and they're within the president's power. If they start to concede that, hey, maybe tariffs were an economic error in some areas, you start asking questions about other things that are being tariffed for reasons that don't really have a coherent message behind them.
To be fair, the argument seems to be, well, this only reduction of tariffs is appropriate only where the U.S. doesn't produce the item. But in everything else, tariffs are still valid. Is that the logic, and does it make sense?
Well, I think that's the superficial logic, because there's actually quite a few things that we don't produce. That ranges everything from raw materials. There are also component parts of things that we manufacture in the United States that you can only get abroad. Only other countries have factories set up to make them. And those are still being tariffed. And Trump is claiming at the same time that, maybe we're trying to reshore them into the United States. But this is a long, drawn-out process that doesn't seem to have much logic or really a plan behind it. Trump is just asserting that this is one of the effects of tariffs, and at the same time is casting uncertainty really across the entire marketplace, because again, the one pattern that we have seen since he started rolling tariffs out back in the spring is that he changes his mind a lot. He goes back and forth. He raises rates. He lowers rates. He gets mad at Canada for a television ad and raises their rate, gets mad at a Brazilian judge, raises the rates there, cuts rates when something turns out to be very unpopular or a company comes to the White House and lobbies him. And this is all kind of odd to watch from afar, but it has serious economic consequences, because what it's basically done is it's thrown United States trade patterns into chaos and uncertainty being the key word, for the better part of the year. And I think everyone is waiting for the Supreme Court ruling to give some clarity of what the policy will be going forward. Hopefully they'll strike down the tariff powers that Trump claims, and that forces him into more conventional patterns and codes of statute that he has to use that are much more predictable, because you can't change them on a whim.
So speaking of that Supreme Court, and speaking of court arguments, it was interesting to see the Trump administration arguing in court that this was a matter of foreign policy, this was a matter of regulatory powers, and not a matter of finance, not a matter of raising money, not a matter of taxation, because tax powers are supposed to be with Congress. And they cited a letter from James Madison where he's discussing tariffs. And he acknowledges that, yes, they have regulatory effects on the economy, but they're also a revenue item, and that the two are inextricably intertwined, and you can't separate them. And just to the argument, I mean, Madison's obviously not there to say this, but the argument that the Trump people are making is foolish on its face.
I think that's absolutely the case, and this is a somewhat famous letter within the history of tariffs and taxation, an obscure niche subject, but nonetheless. So Madison in 1828 was in retirement from his presidency and a very long political career, but there were several events going on, one of which was the beginnings and stirrings of what we now refer to as the nullification crisis. And this is when Congress under Henry Clay passes an extremely high protective tariff, and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, who was then the sitting vice president, but he basically works behind the scenes, and he gets South Carolina to declare that they saw this tariff as unconstitutional because it's too high. And Calhoun's argument was that tariffs are only a tax under the Constitution, and because this tax wasn't being used to raise revenue, it was being used to penalize competitors abroad, it was therefore unconstitutional. And then the state of South Carolina eventually declares that it considers it unconstitutional, and basically says the tariff does not apply in the borders of South Carolina, and it causes this huge showdown with the federal government and Andrew Jackson over the next several years until all the sides eventually de-escalate. But Madison is watching this from his retirement on his farm in Virginia, and he writes a letter to a state legislator friend who's asking, can you make sense of this? You're the father of the Constitution. And he says that the tariff power is concurrently both a regulation and a tax. It regulates commerce because it restricts goods that are coming into the country, but it also raises revenue from them. And you can't really separate these things. And if you look over Madison's entire career, he keeps reiterating this principle all the way from the first Congress to his very last letters at the end of his life. He reiterates this principle that it's both a tariff, or both a tax and a regulatory power. And that's bad news for the Trump administration's argument before the Supreme Court today, because they are trying to claim that it's not a tax power, it's only a regulatory power, because they think that's an easier path to getting the court to accept discretionary presidential exercises of authority, because the Constitution is just so plainly clear that only Congress can raise and lower taxes.
Of course, the Constitution also makes it clear that Congress has the power to regulate interstate commerce.
Indeed. So dual powers of Congress that Trump is claiming, and he thinks he can get away with more on the Commerce Clause side than he can on the tax clause.
Yeah, he thinks
but if
so.
Madison
That's right.
is true, and I think Madison's a good authority on this, it's actually, he has to meet the standards of both and has to meet them simultaneously. And the court made it pretty clear, at least in the comments from the justices, that it does not meet the standard of taxation. And they're also skeptical about the commerce claims.
So in addition, not only is he bragging to the public that he's going to get all this revenue, he's now making promises about a McGovern era type idea, demo grants. So we're going to give out these, what he calls them, tariff dividends. But they're basically just handouts, okay? Supposedly going to be a benefit to the public. It's going to be a stimulus to the economy, and he's going to pay for it with the revenue. This is the idea has many problems, but he's going to pay for it with this revenue.
Well, the best economic models are saying that the average household is probably expecting to pay $3,000 to $4,000 more in higher prices over the next year because of the tariffs. And Trump is saying, okay, well, we're taxing you $3,000 to $4,000 more because your prices are up, and we're going to give you $2,000 of it back. we'll skim some off the top, and then there's also inefficiencies that come from it. So the entire shell game that he's playing here is just an exercise in absurdity. And then on top of that, Scott Bessent, the Secretary of the Treasury, was recently asked about this. As well, how do you propose to enact this tariff dividend, this return? And Bessent kind of reluctantly admitted, well, we'd actually have to get it through Congress. So to get the tariff return, the dividend through, it takes an act of Congress, but Trump somehow thinks he can enact the tariffs in the first place by presidential decree. So they're already contradicting themselves just all over the place in undermining their legal arguments.
So Phil, help me out here on something. It could be the case, it seems to me, that the average family could pay more, that kind of number that you're talking about, 3,000 and more, and yet the government, even though it's promising these 2,000 per family or household or something like that, might not be raising enough money.
That is indeed.
In other words, the families might be paying more than the government is getting because of the distortions in the economy.
Absolutely. You know, tariffs, they raise prices by two ways. One is they slap a tax on something, and that pushes the price up. But they also divert trade away from the international economy, and it allows domestic producers to also raise their price.
Exactly.
They're not taxed.
Because they have less competition.
They have less competition from abroad.
So they raise their prices.
Yeah, and you've got
the
clear
money,
evidence of this.
So, yeah, okay, I think we've summarized it.
I think we're ready to say, stay tuned, and it may well be that our previous analyses of the court cases are going to be proved correct, but we won't know until the Supreme Court issues its ruling. We don't know exactly when they're going to do so. So let's change the subject to a sad one. To me, it's sad. I'm rather sad that the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C., which has done a lot of good over the years, and where I've had a lot of friends who have been associated in one way or another, including board member Robert George, who's been a friend of mine for many decades. He felt obliged to resign from the Heritage Foundation board because of the way Heritage Foundation's president, Kevin Roberts, handled his reaction to Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson, in turn, had Nick Fuentes, who is a pretty outspoken, I would say a fanboy of National Socialism, Nazism. And so Kevin Roberts decided kind of out of the blue, and no one knows why, to issue this big video statement in support of Tucker Carlson after he had Fuentes on. And he said that there was this venomous coalition going against, globalist venomous coalition going against Tucker, and he's going to stand with his buddy Tucker. But of course, the problem with that is that venomous globalist has often been a standard anti-Jewish language historically. So that poor Heritage Foundation seems to be in kind of a blur. Any comments from either of you on how we can best root for, pray for our friends at Heritage Foundation?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a very tricky position, and in many ways, it's a self-inflicted wound. But it goes back to something deeper. Tucker Carlson today is not the Tucker Carlson of 5, 10, or 15 years ago. He was much more a mainstream conservative, even libertarian-ish commentator when he started.
When he wore bow ties.
Yeah, there you go.
I see. Cause and effect, Graham. I get you. Yeah, cause and effect.
It seems that something changed in him, and it's mostly after he departed Fox News a few years ago. And I know there was a big controversy about that, but he's veered into the world of conspiracism. Even before he brought this Fuentes character on, who as you described, is a cheerleader for Hitler. He was also doing interviews with like these World War II revisionists that claim that Churchill was the real villain of World War II and Hitler was just kind of a victim. So he had been veering in this direction for a while and had a lot of people on the right uneasy about it, and including former supporters and former listeners of his. And then this blow-up occurs after Nick Fuentes, and for some reason, Kevin Roberts or his staffers, as he now claims, decided to put out this video reiterating their support for Tucker Carlson. And it was, at absolute best, the most charitable thing I can say about it. It's tone deaf. But then the aftermath of the video, when it's clear that this has caused a lot of problems, it's just a succession of conflicted messaging from Roberts to try to do damage control, and each successive iteration of it seemed to actually inflame the problem even further, to the point that some prominent scholars resigned. Robbie George just resigned from the board, and now it's like an all-out warfare situation that's playing out there that unfortunately has taken it off of its research mission and pulled it into like a really ugly part of American politics right now.
So, Phil, we can't micromanage Heritage, and so we're sad that this has happened to them. But I think you have made in the course of this controversy some, I think, important points about how critics of classical liberalism
Yes.
like to say that all the right is of a certain piece, and that all classical liberalism leads to various ugly effects, supposedly, and the caricature that certain people on the left have been, and so that it's important to distinguish the Fuentes type position and denominate it correctly, describe it, label it correctly. And I wondered if you would expand on that, or tell us more
Sure.
about this, and kind of situate post-liberalism and its extreme variants.
Oh, and I'll just add before you answer, I'll just add that there are quite a few people kind of in the self-identified conservatives who make the argument that, well, classical liberalism and free market capitalism, they lead to moral relativism.
Right. So this is an emerging debate that's occurred in the philosophical circles on the right. And the term for it, there's this new school of thought, although it's some characters that have been around for a while. They call themselves post-liberals. And the idea here, the underlying idea, is that certain tenets of the older, broader right-wing umbrella, the conservative umbrella of the mid-20th century, which had room for classical liberals and libertarians. It also had traditionalists, it had anti-communists, it had some neoconservatives that were more hawkish on military matters, but it was like a broad umbrella that this all contributed to the Barry Goldwater, Ronald Reagan type brand of distinctive American conservatism. And over the years, there were factions within that would debate each other very stridently on many issues, but they all kind of came back to a common theme of at least paying lip service to limited government. They all tended to generally believe in free markets. There was a common respect for the American founding as something distinctive and exceptional in history that makes American conservatism different from like old European monarchism and things like that. Well, the post-liberal movement, it's really only emerged in the last few years, and it's a couple of theorists. So Adrian Vermeule, who's a professor at Harvard, and Patrick Deneen at Notre Dame are probably the two most prominent, and there's some lesser academics around them. But they basically entered the fray by declaring war on the free market component of that conservative tripod, the Reagan coalition. They basically said that markets corrupt, they lead to an economic libertinism, they also neglect the family, and they tie this in really closely with a lot of the protectionist arguments in favor of tariffs. So it grafts on to Trumpism in many ways. It's like the decline of the factory town and the Rust Belt of the West. This is blamed on globalist economic freedom, and we actually need the government to step in and correct that with tariffs and subsidies and industrial policies and a safety net. So it's a real deviation from what American conservatism broadly interpreted has traditionally been. And although I don't think Trump himself even knows what a post-liberal is, a lot of post-liberals have grafted onto Trump. And one of them is his own vice president. J.D. Vance is much more intellectually connected to this crowd and described himself as a post-liberal before he rose into the White House. Well, some of the politics that have been playing out, because the post-liberals despise the free market side. I mean, they want Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek excised from the coalition entirely. And they openly will say this in their books and their speeches and lectures. They basically declared war on the free market component. This creates a gap Well, what fills in behind if you drive the libertarians and classical liberals away? And even though they're not Guipers or Nick Fuentes people themselves, they seem to have a much higher tolerance for some of the old racialist, eugenically tinged, nativist, and economic nationalist elements that were previously pushed out of the right-wing coalition. William F. Buckley, in the 1960s, very famously said, John Birch Society conspiracists, anti-Semites, racists, you're not welcome in our movement. You're a bridge too far. And on top of that, he actually had some other very prominent voices that joined him on that, not just the economic classical liberals, but I was looking today, Russell Kirk, who was basically the intellectual leader of the traditionalist faction of conservatism, joined Buckley and wrote several op-eds and articles saying anti-Semites and conspiracy theorists, you are not welcome in our movement. So this was a very strong kind of an immune system response to that invasion. And I think what the post-liberals have done by shoving aside groups that they dislike and trying to push them out of the right, they've inadvertently, or in some cases covertly, opened the door to these more fringe elements entering in, and the very tail end of that fringe is the Fuentes movement, the anti-Semitism controversies that we're seeing emerge all over the right today.
Very, very succinctly, it's a big topic, so
Yes,
you
really
actually covered it succinctly. So thank you.
What's fascinating to me is that a key figure in sort of one side of this coalitional division was Christopher DeMuth, who was at AEI as the president for years. In fact, I knew him there. And then he became active in speaking at national conservatism conferences and became a member of the staff of the Heritage Foundation. He then quit recently, the Heritage Foundation, over this issue. So really, it seems to me what's needed here is, first of all, I would invite everybody, you, my colleagues and others, to as much as possible give the benefit of the doubt of good intentions to Kevin Roberts. I mean, he may not be able to disentangle himself from his misjudgment. I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt on good intentions, but I think he's really confused and probably not suited to unravel Heritage's problems. But we can give people the benefit of the doubt and also not paint a brush that covers everything with too simple a wash. So, for example, Vice President Vance, sometimes he's hard to figure out. You rightly situated him in that wing of the conservative movement, which is a little skeptical of free markets and the social and cultural fallout of free markets. But there's really no logically intrinsic connection between being concerned about the cultural consequences of free markets and racism and Nazism. There really isn't a logical connection there. It's kind of an affinity connection, a sensibility connection, and I'm not quite sure why it's happening that way. It seems like these people who are concerned about, the downsides of economic liberty are not racists, and yet some of them seem pretty tolerant of the racists.
Well, I have to say that when you abandon classical liberalism, you'd abandon defenses against these sorts of racialist ideas. And I think that's a problem for people that get entangled with that.
Here's an example, a concrete example of somehow these tensions are playing out. The Wall Street Journal a few days ago published a really interesting piece distinguishing President Trump from J.D. Vance on the subject of immigration. Of course, President Trump now seems to be he runs hot and cold on many topics, but now he's much more open to lots of legal immigration, especially high-skilled immigration. He had an interesting interview with Laura Ingraham, who sparred with him over the topic. And he's now staked out a kind of new territory for him, which is much more receptive to larger scale, maybe not mass scale, but larger scale legal immigration. Whereas at a Turning Point event, J.D. Vance put it this way. He said, that I'm going to read you the quote because it's so interestingly precise. My honest view is that right now America, thanks in part to the Biden border invasion, but also thanks in part to a lot of bad immigration policy, Right now, we have let in too many immigrants. We are undercutting the wages of American workers. And he also said he called for limiting legal immigration because he said we have got to become a common community again. And you can't do that when you have such high numbers of immigration. So this is pretty interesting. His call for a common community is, I think, the heart of his position, that Americans need to be united by a common culture, by common principles, common commitment to our history. Common need not be a euphemism for racially pure. But some people in the coalition are taking it that way.
That's what they hear.
There's a lot to unpack in this thing of Vance's. So, there is such a thing as what we could call liberal nationalism. In other words, if we're going to have nation states and they're going to have a history, classical liberals are going to take the liberty supporting aspects of that history, want them to be a salient part of the political culture in that country, and they're still going to, love the country, love their fellow countrymen, but they're going to be attuned to the dangers of nationalism at the same time, because it can become a big state, big government phenomenon. It can lead to war and problems with civil liberties and so forth. So when some people say the United States is only a creedal country, in other words, it's only a country based on the principles.
Vance has resisted that.
That's
right.
Yes, yeah. There's a big debate from that.
And I think classical liberals can say we are a creedal country, but we don't have to abandon the political culture and the history and the lovable features of American life just because we're for a creed that has universalistic aspects to it. We can have both. And it's not wrong to be a classical liberal and appreciates both, but we can also be wary of the quote-unquote blood and soil dangers of certain kinds
we
of
must be wary.
ethno-nationalism. So, that would be our counsel to Vance and people around Vance, or people
to anyone
who
in
have
the
an affinity with him.
administration, frankly.
Exactly.
And to come back to the point I was harping on a minute ago, in fact, it is not the case that free market capitalism inevitably leads to cultural corrosion and moral relativism.
Right.
In fact, it may have its own kind of assistance to blockade the development of those things. Moral relativism and cultural corrosion have actually been products of the cultural left, which has been hostile to capitalism, and
the family.
And the family too, yeah.
I think if you look at great classical liberals of the past, such as Friedrich Bastiat, such as Alexis de Tocqueville, such as Lord Acton, they couldn't be more moral, more
right.
Every meaning of moral, every meaning of ethics and justice and so forth. So
and many of them are very religious. Many of them are in their personal lives.
So, but it is an accusation that is tossed our way.
Yeah. Okay. So I just would say to our friends who are struggling with this elsewhere, hold on to what is in fact the American tradition, which is constitutionalism and the universal principles of individual rights and liberty. These things hold together coherently when properly understood and practiced. We can be patriotic nationalists who love a country that provides individual liberty. It can be done and should be done. It's the safest place to stand.
It's written into our founding documents.
The three of us are proof. Okay.
We are. Okay, aren't we wonderful?
Just be glad we're not in England with its
England is a much more complicated case. So.
England,
yes, it is.
England's got a terrible prime minister right now, and they're having an amazing crack-up around the state-funded, state-operated, certainly state-financed. They claim they're independent. But anyway, the British Broadcasting Corporation is a radio and television, and they have a center-left political culture there that's a total bubble, and it's now gotten them into trouble.
So at the British Broadcasting Corporation in
Yes.
particular, right? Tell us about that a little more, please.
Well, the thing that was the trigger was so it was a process. They have some conservative members, like they have an oversight board, and the different prime ministers put people on. So Boris Johnson put somebody on, and that individual got someone who'd been a staff person at the BBC to write a critique of some of the policies, the biases that have been appearing in the programs. And among the things that this investigator found was that a major program called Panorama on British Broadcasting Television had edited Trump's speech on November 6th before the people went and besieged and entered the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. And Trump had said various things. We should go up there. He said we should march and protest peacefully. And then he said towards the end, he had said, fight, fight, fight. So they edited it. We should go up there and fight, fight, fight. Okay. And it wasn't just this program, as it's turned out in further investigations. Another program did the same thing. And Australian Broadcasting Corporation, which is a completely different entity but has the same cultural problems, did the same thing. So, and indeed, really the message of the mainstream media in the United States was that was what he had done, even though they didn't make this editing thing.
The
that
argument
was their claim that he had done this. So
the argument went like this, though, that yeah, he said go peacefully, but we know that he didn't mean it because that was just pretextual words.
Right.
What he really meant was the fight, fight, fight. So, but then they drew the wrong conclusion by saying, well, therefore we're entitled to snip out the record of what he actually said because we know he didn't mean it. Well, maybe he did and maybe he didn't. How do you know?
Well, you should stick to the. Obviously, broadcast journalists have to edit, have to condense things, but they shouldn't distort the meaning, which they clearly did in this case. And they now admit it, and which is good. But this report also said that on COVID, on Hamas, on various climate controversies, the BBC broadcasters, their editorial decisions, the overall assignments of topics and so forth had been distorted also for quite a few years.
It's a question of putting the thumb on the scale.
Tumbling down. And another thing is that people who have TV sets in Great Britain have to pay a $200 approximately so-called license fee, but it's, as Phil says, a tax. And this is a major part of the budget of the
BBC
Broadcast Corporation. So interestingly enough, Nigel Farage, who's the leader of the Reform Party, which is poised to win the next parliamentary election. I don't know if it's going to happen, but right now they're doing very well. I mean, they're ahead of Labor and they're ahead of the Conservative Party and they're ahead of the Liberal Democrats. And he says he's going to get rid of the license. That would be, majorly.
So is it a regulatory license or is it a tax license?
You're making Madisonian humor here.
There we go.
It's a tax license. But anyway, so conservatives are having a field day that have been frustrated with the BBC. So there's lots of polling data on how influential the BBC is in the lives of the British people. It's hugely influential. I mean, even though there are independent broadcasting groups, including GB News, which is similar to Fox News, but there's alternatives there. But BBC is very, very dominant and very influential.
It's much more akin to the situation in the United States before the emergence of competitive cable news.
Yeah. Right.
That's right.
So we're going to see whether this sifts out properly or whether they're going to get away with it.
Right. But it also, the whole thing relates to problems that American Trumpian conservative movement has with its attitude toward broadcast news, because it has at times been for freedom and variety of views, but then it also, as it's gotten power, started to think, well, maybe it should be our view that's covered.
I think that both the right and the left, both here and
Have
there,
this
have a
problem.
pretty
That's right.
dubious relationship with objectivity and truth.
Yes.
Well, and also on control of news media.
Control.
So,
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So let's get back across the pond, if we may, sticking with Bill Evers for a few minutes here again. It looks to me like the Trump administration, for really the first time ever in Republican presidencies, is actually serious about dismantling the Department of Education. Ronald Reagan said he was going to. He ran on the promise, but he never really even tried. I mean, he couldn't. But now it looks like the Trump administration is going to try and dismantle the thing. Is that true? Can they do it? Is an act of Congress necessary?
well, so the U.S. Department of Education, as we have at present, was established in 1979 in the last part of the Carter administration. And so he had made a promise to the National Educational Association labor union that he was going to do this. President Reagan ran that he was going to dismantle it, and he actually did some things to try to do it, but when he went to Republican leaders in Congress, they said they would oppose him. So, yeah, well, they had various ideas. Some of it was what we see the Trump people doing. So they're not destroying the programs. They're not dismantling the programs. They're moving them to different places in the government. Okay, so student loans go here, civil rights cases go here, special education money goes here, college student loans go here. Instead of dismantling them, they're moving them to different places. That was part of the idea. Not, to me, they've done one thing, that I really am not that happy about. So since the Civil War, the federal government has collected statistics about what's going on, and they kind of
Digestive education statistics.
Yeah, things like that. So I think somebody should be collecting those. Again, it not necessarily have to be the federal government that does it, but a good idea for somebody to collect. Anyway, the way the cuts have gone during this administration, and there are going to be some problems with collecting those statistics. But the point is, they're not. So I was listening to a radio program that we'll call Majority, and the guy was pointing out, well, they're still going to be sending this money. He was commenting on Linda McMahon, the education secretary's description of how they were parceling these into different places, but not getting rid of them. And he said, what? They should be getting rid of them. So we need to distinguish between, and this is something Democratic politicians are not doing, but we should distinguish between getting rid of the programs and reshuffling them. So before 1979, we had the Health, Education, and Welfare Department, and so the programs were there. There were some that were scattered in other places. They were taken out of ATW, concentrated in this Education Department. Going back, there had been a bureau. There had been a sub-cabinet Department of Education right after the Civil War. Then there had been a Bureau of Education that was part of the Interior Department, believe it or not. And, anyway, there's been this history, but they're not doing a thoroughgoing dismantling. They're doing a reshuffling.
So what's going to happen to that ugly building on Maryland Avenue?
Well, it's the American equivalent of Stalinist.
It's horrible
architecture. And then they, I could go on on about the Lyndon Johnson naming, and then the Eisenhower Memorial in front of it, and on and on. It's also not that great on the inside. But
no, I don't like it inside either.
Yeah. So just to clarify to our listeners, I used to be assistant secretary there. But anyway, The point is, I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of buildings in Washington would be better off as museums, but
Yeah.
Or bulldoze them, push them into
and
the
there's
Potomac.
there's a library in it, and those books need to go somewhere. Uh, I, the good thing about this is when you have a central department like this, you can try and micromanage the states more
Yes.
easily
Right.
than if everything is divided up in
And that's
different
bad.
places. So it's a health, and this is what the Reagan people also realized when they were trying to figure out how to dismantle it. So the one solution in the past has been, well, kind of keep it, but make it into something like the National Endowment for the Arts or the National Endowment. That's not a really good idea, because then all you just do is make it a cabinet level department again. It's harder once it's divided and put in different places. It's harder to reassemble. They can do it again.
Yes.
They did it in 1979.
But
And to make it permanent, they do need Congress to act.
That's what I was about to ask.
These are pacts. These are interagency pacts of various sorts that they're announcing.
Otherwise, the next Democrat president comes back and just by a stroke of a pen undoes everything.
Yeah,
and
that's right. They get rid of the pacts. So the Congress would, and I personally, unless I don't see where the votes are in the Senate. I don't see where the 60 votes are in the Senate to make these, but they're trying to habituate people.
So maybe if it becomes a shell of its former self, maybe it'll be easier to formally eliminate it in future.
You have to have the votes, and
You have to have the votes, yeah.
The country,
and to get the votes, if the president really wants to eliminate the department, he really needs to make an argument, a national argument, and an argument to Congress about the importance of eliminating it, which President Trump is really not making.
That's right. And even although it was a campaign promise, and it was even a campaign trial balloon in his very first election in 2016, he's just sort of floated as a slogan rather than some kind of systematic thing.
So let's turn to municipal government for a moment here. So this new mayor in Seattle looks kind of like an ideological clone of Zoran Mamdani in New York City, except maybe worse, because Mamdani has threatened to establish city-run grocery stores, but apparently this new mayor, this woman says she won't allow private grocery stores even to close. So isn't that a confiscation of private property if she won't even allow them to close?
Well, some people have suggested that Mamdani do the same thing. I don't know how she would
classic
effectuate
socialism.
this.
That's right. They impose regulations to make it impossible to operate and impossible to profitably run a store. And then when the natural results of their policies take effect, then they come in and say, no, you're not allowed to leave either.
Right. Yeah.
So she's applied this to both individual stores and to chains. So
wow.
So
effectively
it's kind of forced labor, right?
And effectively making these private companies agents of the city
of the government. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's kind of scary. And then an antidote to this kind of thing might be lurking in the courts. I understand that there's a case coming along which challenges rent control, which she and Mayor Mamdani also advocate, which is also a confiscation, it seems, but that maybe is actually being threatened by legal action by private owners who are claiming now in court cases that the exercise of the power to regulate rents is actually a taking. It's taking private property for public use without just compensation. Do either of you know where the cases stand, and do you think there's any chance?
So I think it's an interesting and novel legal argument that kind of brings back some of the earlier 20th century takings cases that were actually used very successfully in about 1904, 1905, the famous one being Lochner versus New York, to actually stop the government from engaging in regulation. Now, these cases have been attacked mercilessly since that era in
I'll
jurisprudence.
say.
And I think in many cases unfairly so, because oftentimes the parties that were bringing suit that were unfairly regulated were the little guys, very much not agents of big corporations and robber barons as the caricature tends to portray them. But it's been a turn in jurisprudence to even have that argument coming back. And the interesting thing will be, is there enough of a majority in the Supreme Court now that is interested in revisiting some of the conventional wisdom of the 20th century that was very harsh against using takings as a mechanism to offer compensation for bad regulation?
So we should give credit to Richard Epstein.
Yep, he's been one of the major
He has tried to
figures.
revive the importance and value of using the takings clause. I think, this other case where private beaches that were closed in Florida during the COVID lockdowns, where the courts have held that was a takings. You can read that. You can read some of the literature related to this rent control thing, and you can see that the rent control thing is going to be harder to get through the court
I would think
successfully
so.
than the beaches one. And so, of course, it would be a great thing if takings was reinvigorated and effective control by the government amounted to a taking. But as Phil has said, the New Deal revolution in the jurisprudence of the Supreme Court is still a problem. It's still with us, even though it's incrementally being worn away.
Let me just try a devil's advocate thing for a minute, and maybe you two can clarify or set my devil's advocate straight. So, as devil's advocate, I'm looking at this beach case, Walton County, Florida, by the way, west of Tallahassee, where during the COVID lockdowns, they closed both public and private beaches. And they did that for the sake of trying to protect public health and prevent the spread of the epidemic, right?
A beach actually being probably the safest place you could
Probably
possibly
exactly.
be.
But they didn't know. So they closed the beaches, both public and private. Isn't that potentially just an exercise of the Amendment 10 general power, that we call it the police power to protect the health, safety, welfare, and morals of the citizenry, which is a governmental power protected by the 10th Amendment? Why isn't this simply an exercise of discretion for the common good protected by the 10th Amendment?
I think it's another of these constitutional areas where there are parallel powers that are distinct in one sense, but they're also intertwined in another sense, because the same Bill of Rights requires eminent domain payments for property as it's seized.
Right.
So I think the police power is not really a constitutional power. It's like an underlying power.
Yes,
so it's
that's
something
right.
we inherited from Britain. And it involves all sorts of things like public accommodations and what the meaning is of that, and this public health stuff and so forth. It's often, the practical application of this have often troubled classical liberals because it seems to have too open-ended a power to the state.
Right.
And so my answer to you, Graham, would be, so let's trim back the police power and make it a narrower power.
Well, maybe, but here's my own answer, maybe to myself, which is that the plenary power protected by the 10th Amendment of the states is a pretty broad power, but it is explicitly and concurrently limited by the protection of individual rights, as you said, Phil, in the rest of the Constitution, the rest of the Bill of Rights. And so the plenary power exists except where it is protected against in the name of individual rights by the text of the Constitution. And the Fifth Amendment protects individual property owners from having their property confiscated without just compensation. So the 10th Amendment and the Fifth Amendment are part of one whole cloth. And
we're glad you've worked your way through this.
I worked my way through it. So the 10th Amendment, yes, it's plenary, except where it is
when it's not
limited.
Plenary.
Limited, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
So there's an amusing thing that happened in terms of discovery of fascinating things. This private beaches thing is a kind of an obscure but absolutely fascinating. And that is there's a public policy institute in Illinois, and they discovered that the teachers union in Chicago, which is always blathering about how they serve not only their own members, but they serve the general public. They serve the community. This is part of they even have a slogan that they're doing community bargaining, not just, their own salaries and working conditions. So they have a $173 million recording studio in New Mexico with a swimming pool.
Wow.
And some occasional harsh critics of teachers' unions have wondered exactly what is going
What's
on
the need
here.
here?
Anyway,
Let's come to a landing by looking back across the Atlantic. There's this case that Bill drew to my attention about a critic of the government who was punished for expressing his criticism. Can you explain what that's about, Bill, and how can this happen in a modern liberal democracy?
well, the thing is, and this is true in Germany and England. There's been a lot of coverage of both of these. They have very sensitive kind of laws of lèse-majesté about how you can criticize the government, how disruptive a criticism you can make before the police hand something to you. Maybe they say you're doing a non-offensive offense or whatever. They have crazy things in these different countries. So there's a man who put on social media his idea that public servants, that civil servants, government employees don't really pay taxes. This is a kind of an obscure point in financial tax, fiscal policy economics, that they don't really pay taxes because their salary is like, I don't know, I'm not putting it clearly enough. But the point is, he's saying they're net parasites on the body politic. And so for calling the civil servants parasites, he was had a raid on his house, and he was arrested
For calling them
in Germany.
parasites.
Yeah.
Wow.
So let me just state. Okay, so if you're anyway, that was the essence of it.
That's hard to believe.
Yeah.
It's a little shocking. Why don't I give both of you a chance here toward the end? Would you like to make a final comment on today's news or upcoming things? I know Phil always has his finger on the pulse of the tariff issue. That or anything else, Phil Magnus, that you'd like to comment on in closing?
Well, I think I'd just more generally reiterate that there is something distinctive about the United States and its founding, whether it's the free speech issue, whether it's the functional mechanisms of our Constitution to rein in things like executives that try to decree tariffs. There's also a distinctive feature of the American right that is imbued with individualism and liberty as a principle. And that's everything from the libertarian elements of it all the way to the traditional conservatives have always recognized. And we're seeing a lot of these principles strained at the moment, whether it's assaults on free speech, whether it's demonstrations that the free speech rights we take for granted in the United States are not honored abroad, whether it's tensions internally to the way that we view our economic policy or indeed the broader intellectual climate. And, that's an important discussion to keep in mind as we move into our 250th year next year.
Hear, hear. Bill Evers.
Well, from my disciplinary efforts at analyzing education and education policy, which is my prime directive, I was amused by reading that in South Korea, students at one of the top national universities in the country have been taking a course on artificial intelligence. And they were given an exam at the end of the course. and they proceeded to use artificial intelligence to cheat on the exam about artificial intelligence. So that kind of tickled my fancy. This whole thing about artificial intelligence, which I think it's fair to say, I wouldn't say that we use it to an extensive extent, but it kind of operates now as a kind of research assistant to us. How we can say, well, we can go on artificial intelligence and say, what's an article about cheating using artificial intelligence? And it'll come up with things like this. So it has practical uses, but it also has uses that are potentially immoral or even dangerous. So it's a new world, and I hope the society adjusts to it well.
Thank you, Bill. I'm going to make just one other comment of my own. Coming back to underscore something that Phil Magnus said a moment ago, I would just add to your point that I think that the concrete historical practice of constitutionalism is more important for the common good, more important for liberty than even the abstract ideals of liberalism. There's something about the concrete historic practice of our constitutionalism which is remarkably protective and that everyone can hold on to, even if their abstract ideals may differ. And that's quite a virtue, I think.
I think it's a virtue, but I'm still basically grounded in classical liberalism myself.
Okay. Thank you both so much. And especially I give my thanks to our friends who join us for these conversations. You can always find this and more like it on our website, which is independent.org. And a lot of other important analytical material, including published pieces by my two colleagues here, Bill Evers and Phil Magnus. Thank you, Phil, for joining us.
Happy to be here. Thanks for hosting.
And Bill Evers, I'm always so happy to have you.
Thank you.
Come back and join us again on Independent Outlook. Take care.